Hi, this is Bill Cunningham of the Box Tops, and I just had a blast doing a show with Dick on his American Oldie But Goodies, the 60s show. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. It's great talking about the oldies and goodies.
There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day. There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, and tomorrow's just a dream away.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another encounter with some groovy moments from the past. We're visiting the 60s with host Dick Scapitoni, whose pop group Harper's Bazaar had a hit record back then called Feelin' Groovy. He'll be talking with our guests about a decade that shaped a whole generation, not only with the most magnificent music ever made, but also the politics, protests, and pretty much everything that happened in the swingin' 60s. So Dick, who's on today's show?
Thank you, John. What do you think of when you hear somebody say, "Give me a ticket for an airplane, ain't got time to take a fast train"? Well, if you remember the 60s like I do, you think of the Box Tops. The Letter was an international hit in September 1967, reaching Billboard's #1 slot and staying there for 4 straight weeks. The Box Tops bass player Bill Cunningham, boy, say that 4 times fast, was already from a musical family in Memphis and was yet to find out how many career changes he would go through over the years. But we'll find out today because Bill Cunningham is our guy.
Give me a ticket for an aeroplane. Ain't got time to take a fast train. Lonely days are gone, I'm a-going home. My baby just wrote me a letter. I don't care how much money I gotta spend. Got to get back to my baby again. Lonely days are gone, I'm a-going home. My baby just wrote me a letter. When she wrote me a letter, said she couldn't live without me no more. Listen, mister, can't you see I got to get back to my baby once more? Anyway, yeah, give me a ticket for an aeroplane. Ain't got time to take a fast train. Lonely days are gone, I'm a-going home. My baby just wrote me a letter. When she wrote me a letter, said she
A bass player, a keyboard player, a classical musician, played in many symphony orchestras and ballet and opera companies, even was there at the signing of the Israeli Accords. Doesn't sound like it's related, but Bill Cunningham is going to tell us exactly how. As a member of one of the hottest 60s groups, the Box Tops, his story reads like an encyclopedia of musical dreams. So, Bill Cunningham, welcome to America's Oldies But Goodies. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dick. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's go all the way back, if you're up for it, maybe to your early musical days, and then bring us up through the whole Box Tops career time in the 60s.
I came from a musical family, so music wasn't anything strange. As a matter of fact, I thought everybody came from musical families, I guess, as a kid. Certainly a lot of people did in Memphis. But my dad was a singer and was a Sun recording artist and worked for Sam Phillips, who was a neighbor of ours.
I'll be darned.
And my dad not only recorded as an artist at Sun, but he also was sort of responsible for a lot of the back work, getting the pressings of the Sun records and that kind of stuff. So he knew everybody, and everybody knew him. So that's an interesting sort of background that most people don't run into, particularly from 1953 through about 61 or 62. So he was there during all the Elvis stuff. He was actually the first percussionist on an Elvis Presley record as well. So it was I Don't Care If the Sun Don't Shine. So he was there for all the very first recordings. And
did you have a chance to talk with him much about what was going on every day? I mean, I wasn't
very old at all when he was down there, although they used to drag me down when there wasn't a babysitter or something, and I would have to sit outside in the little office there with, the secretary and wait for him to get finished in the studio as they finished up. But he was there for all of the Sun recording stuff with Jerry Lee. He was good drinking buddies with Jerry Lee. Can you imagine that? And, the Carl Perkins stuff and Johnny Cash and all that. So, and my brother was also a musician. I guess my dad had influenced him. And so he was a session guitarist and later played with a number of different groups. But and he was a solo artist, too, at the beginning, at the end of the 50s, but the beginning of his career. But he ended up forming a group that eventually got known as the Hombres and wrote and sang and played keyboards on a song called Let It All Hang Out. So we have, a lot of musicians in my family. My grandfather was a violinist. I think my grandmother even played guitar, so.
You were almost naturally drawn to it. What was the first instrument you played?
The first instrument I played was piano.
Okay.
When I was a kid, I couldn't even see the keyboard from the floor, and I remember reaching up and touching one of the keys, and when I touched that key, it made that sound. I just knew that's what I wanted to do. Oh,
for God's sake, that's a great story. And did you end up taking piano lessons, or you just kind of came to it naturally?
I think a little of both, and that I did take lessons when I was young. I didn't take it for very long, but I took it, and then later on I ended up taking lessons. And, certainly through my career after the box tops, when I went back to get a degree in classical music and performance, I had to take, obviously lessons not only on my instrument, which was contrabass at the time, but also on cello and also on piano for piano proficiency, and I had to play all kind of what they call boards, that is, perform for various teacher panels to pass a certain level of proficiency and that kind of stuff. But I already played well by that time, and the piano department directors actually taught me off the record at the university for 2 years, trying to convince me to move over to the piano department because I played piano probably as well as most of the people in the piano department.
Yeah.
So, but that's jumping way ahead. So getting back to when I was young and touching the keys. So I took some lessons, and I guess the first performance that I ever did in a sort of really public area was at a assembly in elementary school. And I just played piano. I played Yellowbird or some song like that. If anybody remembers that, a lot of people my age remember it.
I remember it, sure.
Yeah, there you go. I don't remember exactly what the response was. I think it was fine and favorable or whatever. But then later in middle school, I put together a band and we did a talent show, which was typical of those periods. And this was the period when the Rolling Stones had just released Last Time, and that was the song we chose to play on the talent show. And it was just released that week, and the kids went wild.
Gee.
So that was, I think, the first real taste I had, so to speak, in my mouth of, ooh, this could be fun.
Yeah. I think, I can look back on some of my early memories as well. What happens is you become accustomed to listening to, quote, famous singers on the radio or on your LPs, and you don't necessarily think of yourself doing it, but when you start to do it and there's an audience, it's like the light bulb goes on, and you say, as you did, I think I would like to do more of this.
Yeah. It's sort of like getting a drug almost. It's addicting. Mm-hmm. If you start to get this audience response and you see the reaction and stuff. Now, mind you, I still had a couple of models in my family that were doing it professionally. Mm-hmm. So that was, that I could see it could be done.
Yeah.
So that it wasn't like I was coming from a family that didn't have anyone in the industry. So I actually saw how it was done. So I knew it could be done. I just didn't realize till I was in middle school that I was actually capable of doing the same kind of thing.
And that first middle school group, were you playing the music of the time, the rock and roll? What were you playing?
Yeah, mostly, I think at that time we were probably playing mostly British invasion tunes. Like I said last time when the Stones were that. So this is Satisfaction in terms of Stone music. We were playing, all kind of stuff that was coming out, whatever was contemporary. But we didn't last very long. And as I moved over to high school, then I formed another group with a guy named Chris Bell, who later ended up in a group with the Box Tops lead singer after the Box Tops, a group called Big Star, which a lot of people probably don't know of, but the ones who do know of them are very fanatical fans of theirs usually. And actually, even in England, they're known as the American Beatles.
Really?
Yeah, so if you haven't heard of them, you might actually try to check out some of their tunes. I'm sure they've got them on YouTube and other places as well. But their albums were cited, even though they never got really famous. Their albums, I think their first 3 albums were all cited by Rolling Stone as some of the top albums ever recorded.
Interesting. What was the group name at that time?
Big Star.
Big Star, and it was Chris Bell.
Yeah, and so I worked with Chris, and Alex Chilton, our lead singer, used to be at all the parties and performances. This group that I was in with Chris, called the Jinx at the time, he would come and see all these shows, and we tried to get him to join the group, and he sang with us for a couple of weeks, but he was off running around with the girls or whatever, and we couldn't get him to focus on the music scene or something. I don't know why.
Yeah, right.
But later on, Alex and I went through maybe one other group, and then Alex called me for what became the Box Tops. We were called the DeVilles, and when we were about to release The Letter, our first single, we did a research and found out that somebody was already called the DeVilles, nationally.
Okay.
And so we had to, come up with some name other than that to release under, and so we released it under the name of the Box Top.
Do you remember how you came up with that? That whole area of group names is absolutely classic. Did you make a list of names and start picking from them?
No, we all tried to come up with something, and it wasn't going so well. But someone said, well, maybe we could just have people mail in names, like they do, and like they used to ask people to tear off cereal boxes and mail in the Box Tops.
Yeah.
And somebody said, yeah, that's it. And I thought, oh, no, that's not it. That's a terrible name. And I really was embarrassed by the name until the letter hit number 1, and then I was fine.
Yeah, then it worked out pretty good.
Yeah, from then on, it sounded natural to me. It's like, oh, yeah, that's okay.
I think back to one of the first names that we had come up. We had all kinds of early names and went through, like you did, a number of different groups. I think the last name before Harper's Bazaar was the Tikis. We didn't think of Harper's Bazaar. We got signed to Warner Brothers, and they said, we don't like the name the Tikis, come up with something else. We came up with, and for the life of me, I still can't explain it to this day, the Archdiocese, which Warner said, no, the Catholic Church probably won't like that. And apparently a secretary at Warner's came up with the Harper's Bazaar, spelling it differently than the magazine, and we said, fine, just release the record. So that's how it came about. But I've got, as I'm doing interviews, it occurs to me, I want to start asking groups how they came up with their name, because it's something that all groups have been through, and they've been through a zillion names. So, and the Box Top Stories is interesting how you say the song hits number 1 and you're just fine with it at that point. We were the same way with Harper's Bazaar. We really didn't care, but when the record did well, we said, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let me ask you, I'm going to shift for just a minute. What do you consider to be among your most notable successes?
Certainly, the Box Tops and putting out the letter probably had some of the most important effect on my life and changed my life the most. So I can't deny that or run away from it, not that I would. And I don't know what it would be like not to have done that, because I didn't go through anything else, so I don't have anything to compare it to. But I do know that opportunities and the people I worked with and the places I've gone are all different as a result of releasing that record. So that's certainly one of the big things. But I also was successful after the Box Tops. I quit actually while we were still on top of the charts and at the tail end, and I shifted to classical music and got a classical degree, which I've already sort of mentioned earlier. But I got a classical degree in upright bass, or what they call contrabass, and I played with a lot of different famous classical musicians, Van Cliburn. I've done shows with Dionne Warwick and Eddie Arnold. I mean, just all kind of different people. And then the last, I think you mentioned in the introduction that, there were a number of different people I worked with at the Camp David Accord, the signing of Camp David Accord. Of course, I worked with, maybe not of course, but I did work with the Israeli delegation that only had 2 musicians, and they were named Itzhak Perlman and Pinka Zuckerman, and they wanted a quintet. So somebody said, who wants to play with them? And I was there, and I raised my hand, and I got to play with them.
That's amazing.
That was my actual last classical gig. So there are a lot of different things that could be considered successful. I've also done non-musical things that were, could be cited as successful as well.
All right, let's shift gears for a moment and listen to the music. What song would that be?
Yeah, now let's step out of the music for just a second. Go to those places. What other things have you done?
Well, I shifted from classical music into international trade and started working in that area. And back in the early 80s, a lot of people will remember, if you think about it, Japan was taking over most all of industry production. And there was a sentiment here in this country and maybe elsewhere in the world that somehow or another they were unfavorably competing, and they had a collusion of think tanks, universities, private industry, and government, and sort of picking winners and losers. And there was, as far as industry production and stuff. And I got involved in international trade, and Congress actually sent me and 2 other people to Japan and later to the rest of the world, a lot of different places, different areas, both Europe and South America and Asia, to research industrial trade policy of all these countries. So we talked with all the different major players in the EU and everywhere else, including Japan, to find out what their policies were. So we talked to government, we talked to major institutions, we talked to American companies doing business there, went through plants and all these different production facilities, for the local companies that were producing as well. And we came back and wrote a series of reports that eventually put to rest and clarified what was going on worldwide as far as industrial competition and trade. And the result of that, the bottom line of that, is that it staved off what was about to be a trade war between the United States and Japan, which would have not gone well, I think, for either country.
What's amazing, that is such a stretch from the music thing, actually from the Box Tops and then into classical music, but it almost feels like the way you're describing it, you were pretty pumped up with this particular profession. It sounds like you really got into it. Is that what happened?
Yeah. I got a degree in international business, an MBA, one of the early ones, and I thought, I went in it as far as the degree for mercenary reasons. I just thought, I walked into the university and said, what can I get a degree in that would make me marketable and also give me an opportunity to earn money and easily and shift fields and stuff? And they said, well, what do you like to do? I said, well, I like international languages. I'd lived abroad some and, been exposed to foreign cultures and had some language capability from my early university days. And they said, okay, you could be, you could get a political science degree or a degree in international, something or another. I said, what could I do with that? They said, well, you could work for the Foreign Service. I said, well, what if I don't want to work for the Foreign Service? They said, well, you could teach. I said, well, I could teach already with a music degree, pick up some education stuff and just teach music. And then they said, well, they got this MBA program that's brand new. And I said, what could I do with that? They said, oh, you could do anything you want to with that. I said, okay, I'll do that.
Sign me
up. And then they said, well, there's a lot of math, and it's really advanced math, advanced calculus and all kind of different things. I said, I don't care.
Yeah.
And so I started doing that, and it was crazy. I studied and I practiced music hard, and I was going up to the top trying to get into Philadelphia or New York Philharmonic. And the competition was such that they were still making decisions about who was getting spots in orchestras, even at that level, based on relationships with, like the nephew of the person who hands out the sheet music or something. And I thought, I'm just going to change fields, And then when I changed fields, the very first semester, I'm taking Accounting 101 and Economics 101, which I never knew anything about or anything like that. But I started taking that because I had to pick up some undergraduate work before I started my master's to backfill in the business area. And I swear, the first semester, somebody stopped me and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm studying for an MBA. And they said, oh, really? You want a job? Part-time or whatever? And I said, sure. And so they hired me immediately. I started doing the books for a company instantaneously. So much respect. But I spent hours, 8 hours a day practicing in a little cubicle for classical music and then performing the rest of the day, probably for another 6 hours, performing with orchestras or doing recordings or whatever, and everybody loved it. But it's like, the respect I got just from getting Econ 101 or Accounting 101 showed me how ridiculously slanted some of the people's opinions are about different backgrounds.
Yeah, and when you're talking about, you mentioned the upright bass or the contrabass. Were you 99% of the time using a bow rather than...
oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right, yeah.
I mean, I knew how to play pizzicata, obviously, and I did that on recording when I needed to or whatever. But, no, I was constantly bowing. My bow technique was great. Everything was classical, absolute top.
You've already mentioned a number of memorable people. Any other names that just people that you've worked with that you came across during your whole career, not just the... Well, you know what? Let me interrupt myself. How old were you when you had the letter?
17.
17. Just amazing. And that whole process, by the time you had left... what was it, like 2 years or something, and then you left it?
I was a has-been at 19,
Yeah. Jeez. Well, let's talk about some of the other memorable people that have come down the pike with you over the years. Any other names you can throw out?
Well, we've certainly been on stages with all kind of people. I mean, just as an example, and a lot of people that are listening will recognize this from their days, too. I remember playing, like, in San Diego, and it had Sonny and Cher, The Byrds, Linda Ronstadt and the Stone Ponies, Buffalo Springfield, The Turtles, and us, and there are probably two or three other groups. And it probably cost, like, $2.50 to get in,
That's right.
But those are the kind of shows you used to see back in those days. But as far as really memorable things, we toured a lot with the Beach Boys. We did it, probably 60 to 70 dates with them through 3 rounds of tours, I think. The Doors made an impression on us. When we first came out of Memphis, we were, the sort of like, well, we didn't know what we were, but we were dressing in all the the suits that all the artists were buying their clothes from, and Elvis bought his clothes from, Lansky Brothers there in Memphis. And we saw the Doors, and then they weren't wearing the same kind of clothes, and, Jim Morrison had leather pants, and we immediately just chucked the suits and started dressing in a different style. So they had an odd effect on us, not musically, but just sort of a culturally just looking at it, so they gave sort of a freedom. But I've also done things, with, you mentioned ballet companies that I've worked with. I've done television broadcasts with Mikhail Baryshnikov. I've also worked with Rudinev and the Royal Canadian Ballet Company. I did soundtracks with Jim Henson's Muppets. So my list is really all over the place.
Oh, it is. Yeah, I mean, that's just amazing. All the different spots that you've tuned into, even just from the musical perspective. The Box Tops thing, of course, is the most obvious thing that our listeners know and that I know, but you've touched on all kinds of areas. It's just amazing. It sounds like you are really passionately involved. When you get involved in something, it's not a passing thing. You actually get heavy into it. Am I right with that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. The other sort of, I'll describe it as a problem I have, is every time I learn something, I want to dig into it. So when I was taking physics at the university, I wanted to become a physicist.
Okay.
It's like, I can't stop myself from like, wow, but then I got out of that one because I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do, sort of Einstein relativity kind of, outer space and beyond kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or the quantum mechanics down to at that time, the quarks were the latest, thing, but, the atomic level. So I knew I couldn't satisfy myself because I couldn't do both, and so I just gave that up. I mean, I took physics and I did okay, but it's like, no, I'm not going to go down this field.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of endless when you're attracted to as many things as you are, and you've got all the options that you have. Sounds like you fairly easily pick up things and can easily be drawn into them, probably to find out at some point in time that there's something else out there calling. For my listeners, and in my time frame, and I'm older than you, I was born in 1945, we can remember back in the day when we were as fit as a fiddle, and now, as aging baby boomers, we probably no longer look much like Jack LaLanne. If you're up for talking about it, how's your health nowadays?
My health is good. I would say it's really quite excellent. And I attribute it to a couple of things. I actually work with a trainer and have done for well over a decade. So I'm constantly learning, and as you've already mentioned and I've already referenced, you know how it is when I get into things, right?
Yeah.
So I've read probably all the books on training and all the certification books for trainers, and I get into all this. And of course, along with training, one of the other things that's extremely important is eating, right?
Yeah.
Because you put things in your body. So I tend to eat organic. So between training, exercising, because we're meant to move, okay? We're not meant to just sit somewhere or lie down somewhere. Our body is meant to actually move. And if you don't move, you lose the muscle and you lose the ability and the flexibility. So, that and eating, I think, are the most two important things that I would recommend people pay attention to. And you don't have to wait till you're sick or with an ailment, whether it's, diabetes type 2 or whatever, but anything, arthritis or anything else. You really do need to move, push things, lift things. Now, you need to do it right. So that's the part of training, or at least researching before you do it and working slowly. But also, eating well and training. And one saying that I will repeat, it's not something I made up, but something I've read that always made sense to me. You can either pay the farmer or you can pay the doctor. And that means you can either buy good food, quality food, and pay the farmers to raise the good food, or you're going to get sick and then you're going to have to pay the doctor to treat your ailments from being sick.
Yeah, so true. And I think it's in our time now, as we're all in the baby boomer age, we're starting to hear more and more about each other's ailments. It's funny, I go back maybe 30 years ago, how we used to joke about whenever we got together with our parents and their friends, the common subject was what somebody's doctor told them they should be doing. And we used to always laugh at that. Well, now I'm 71 and I don't talk about my doctor a lot, but still it is a much more common subject for me now than it was, say, 30 years ago.
Okay, folks, it's time for a momentary diversion. We'll take a quick break and be back in a flash.
Amen. 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 Sing it over. Amen. 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 See the baby wrapped in the manger on Christmas morning. See him in the temple talking with the elders who marvel at his wisdom. Down at the Jordan where John was baptizing and saving all sinners.
And the whole eating thing, it sounds like you've got a really good handle on it. I am about to shift over to vegetarian. Not that I eat a really lousy diet, but I've got type 2 diabetes and I need to bring the numbers down. And I think what may help me do it, in addition to moving, as you say, moving, is getting into more of a vegetarian diet. Do you mix in steaks and hamburgers with what you eat, or how does that?
I do. I think the trick to meat, if you want to eat meat, and I'm not telling people what to eat exactly, but if you want to eat meat, I think the trick is to eat meat that has been grass-fed and raised properly. Mm-hmm. So the meat that you would buy, I mean, I don't like eating out so much because I know what I'm buying when I'm buying from a farmer. And I actually, go to farmers to buy my beef or chicken or even the eggs and stuff, to the extent I can. I even entertained buying a cow for milk. Just to be able to get sort of non-pasteurized milk, because you can't own that where I live. There's only 6 states in the union that allow you to buy that. California being one of them. By the way.
Really? Okay, I didn't know that. Huh.
But where I live, you have to actually literally have to own the cow. So there's things called cow sharing, where 6 people go in and buy a cow and pay the farm to raise and house the cow, and then pay the medical veterinarian care for the cow.
That's interesting.
You rotate and you go pick up all the milk every week and bring it out and then redistribute the milk to everybody.
Now, so I'm curious. You buy a cow. What are we talking dollar-wise? $1,000, $5,000?
I assume they go for different prices, but your share would certainly be under $1,000.
Yeah,
for sure.
Interesting.
I think the bottom line to all of this conversation about health is you need to do things to avoid getting problems down the road and not just wait to get sick, get ill, can't move, have problems doing something before you start to.
Having that insight, I think, and I didn't have that insight, and I don't suffer from a lot of stuff, and I don't really suffer from the type 2 diabetes, but
and we're all wherever we are, depending on what we've done and our genetics, too. My only point is, wherever you are, think about starting today. Think about what you're doing and see if there's anything lifestyle-wise that you might want to change.
As you mentioned, when it's, quote, too late, the natural fix-it point seems to be to go to the doctors and, expect the medical community to take care of it, which in many cases they do to some extent, but they don't necessarily get rid of it. They simply...
They treat the symptoms.
Yeah,
they use drugs, which, if we didn't have drugs, a lot of people would be in more pain, that's for sure. But drugs themselves are not a cure for anything. They just sort of dull the pain or century or temporarily fix whatever it is, or they do it with operation. Either one is not a preferable method, although they're both faster and easier in some way to deal with than changing your lifestyle.
Yeah, that's true.
But changing your lifestyle keeps the quality and the functionality in your life, and that's what I'm trying to do with mine.
Yeah,
is to keep myself as functionally well as I can for as long as I can. Eventually, something will come get you anyway, but, until then, I want to feel as good as I can and be as flexible and as strong as I can be.
Now, speaking of taste, here's a segue. Have your musical taste changed since the 60s, and what kind of music do you listen to now?
I think the main thing I would listen to, or is what we call for rock and roll and stuff, is still going back mostly to the 60s, although my son has influenced me with younger audience music. So I've always been very eclectic to what I listen to. And I've always said, and I thought I made this up, but I found out later that Duke Ellington and others have said it way before I ever was alive. There's good music and there's bad music, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's really a personal preference and taste. So there's no such thing as absolutely defined bad music or good music. But you have your preferences. So I tend to listen to whatever I want to from whatever field. And you already know from the conversation that I like classical music early on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the interesting things, though, about listening is sometimes, at least in my case, I got to a point where, I knew most of the stuff in the classical catalog for the orchestral work and a lot of smaller ensemble work. I knew a lot about what the 60s and the 70s and maybe some of the 80s music, bits and pieces of some other things here and there from the pop scene. But one thing that I sort of gnawed on me was that I knew some great musicians who were huge fans of opera.
Oh, yeah.
And I never could figure out why I didn't like opera, So I'd put some opera on, just the excerpts at first, And I just, it was like chalk on a blackboard to me or something. I just, couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
But I never gave up. And so at one point I was determined I was going to figure out what it was why I was deficient, why these good musicians I respected were thrilled with opera. And eventually, after persisting for probably almost a decade, it finally hit me, and I finally understood opera. And so that's sort of a strange path to take. But as a result, I've broadened my listening skills and broadened my appreciation to include things such as opera.
You know what's interesting? I can look back, I'm going to say maybe 20 years ago. I never listened to opera at that time, and I think my only recollection was that I really didn't like the screechy soprano voices, drove me nuts. But it occurred to me at some point, this stuff's been around for like 300 years. Why is it still around? There must be something going on there. And about that time, that's when I stumbled across Pavarotti, and my whole life changed musically at that point. And the crazy thing is, and I still listen to certain select operas, some of the most obvious, Puccini and Verdi.
Yeah.
But what's really funny is, and I'll bet you understand some of the lyrics. I understand none of them, or they're in a foreign language. But that doesn't matter because the emotional...
from the expressions.
Yeah, it's the emotional level, and it's amazing that it happens when you don't have a clue what they're saying, but you feel the emotion that's happening really strong. Yeah,
and if you ever go to the opera, then you get a visual inspiration to it. It's not like watching it on television. It's different.
Yeah.
It's sort of like going to a live performance of Harper's Bazaar or the Box Tops.
Right.
It's not the same as actually listening to the recording, and that there's something different. There's something unique about the audience, and they actually in some way participate with an actual performance. They help create an actual performance as well as the artists themselves. In opera, you get all of that. So you're in there with the audience, you're hearing it, you got the singers, you got the people doing the staging, the different mats and the different scene settings and stuff like that, and the lighting and just, everything that goes together. And it's quite powerful if you need to sort of study up a little bit on the at least the synopsis of the opera, so you'll know what's going to go on if you don't actually study the lyrics and the libretto and everything else in the opera. But if you do opera the right way, it can be quite an experience.
Well, I think, and I'm going to guess you probably would agree, talking to younger people who are strictly into rock and roll or rap, as whatever the case may be, we would both probably say, take a chance on listening to some other things that you normally wouldn't even consider at all, and give it a little bit of time. Opera, it took me a while. It sounded like it took you a while, but
yeah, it took me a long time. I said a decade.
It is valuable. Once it clicks,
once it clicks, you're sold. And what is, there's certain operas you can go to, that are easier than other operas to get into. But whichever one or ones that click with you in the early stage, they really become almost like your own baby. And then it's easier to get into the other ones. Once you've gotten past one, whether that's a light operetta kind of thing like the Fledermaus, or if it's something like Carmen that has a lot of tunes that people sort of recognize. Anything that finally gets you there, once you're there, then you can step off and then you can get into Puccini and other things. And it's easier to do.
And I've seen Moonstruck, I think, 15 times, only because I happen to like Cher and I like what she did in the movie. But that's La Boheme, I think, is where. Yeah,
it's a great opera. Not the one I would say to start with, although there are a couple of duets and arias in that are absolutely great. Well, more than a couple, but most people would recognize one or two of them anyway.
What has been your most challenging experience, regardless of whether you achieved it or not?
I mentioned the trade war threat that was going on with Japan, and that was probably 3 years out of my life that I really spent digging and traveling the world and trying to really find an answer so I could report to Congress. And the effect of that and all, but just the effort that went into that was gigantic.
As I think about that, and I've never done anything like that, but it feels to me like could be a major challenge, in part because you are talking to or coming in contact with so many different people at so many different levels who are also weighing in with their own particular opinion. Is that what was happening?
Yeah. Everyone had opinions, everyone had facts, and, it's a question of trying to bring everybody up to speed. One thing I'll mention, and it connects to the music thing, just so you know the world isn't just black and white. This isn't just international trade kind of thing. Let me tell you why I think I was successful in doing what I did in international trade. Because of my music background, I knew how to play in an ensemble. I knew how to play in an orchestra, and I knew how to guide and direct people in concentrated ways to bring outcome. And I think what I did, and as a musician, you have to listen to everybody and everything that's going on simultaneously while paying attention to your own contribution. Right? And it's the same thing even in this, where I was able to actually see the big picture, know from what we were gathering, what directions were going, and how to communicate that and how to direct everyone's attention in a focused way so that everybody was, could make their decisions, could understand the situation and stuff. And a lot of people cannot do that.
Well, and that's interesting because I think back to initially when we both got into bands, what that was collaboration, and it seemed to really be a way to move forward in a direction. It's almost,
right.
I think back to, having 3 or 4 other guys around me, and we're all pointed in the direction of success, and we're going to get there come hell or high water. Nothing can stop us. That collaboration sets the stage for your ability to move into a completely different area and yet bring people together and understand, I probably shouldn't say the vibes of what was going on, but you understood it.
No, I understand exactly, and I think vibes is correct.
Yeah.
I think it's the nuances, it's the non-vocalized expression and attitudes that we know how to read.
Interesting. What do you see as some of the biggest differences between the 60s and now?
Growing up in Memphis in the 60s, it was a really magical time. And there was so much going on, and it's not the same way necessarily. But at the time I grew up, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners were growing up, it was common for radio to play a variety of music. It was common for television to present on the 3 channels that everybody here in the United States to present and get present information, news, on entertainment, so everybody turned into Gunsmoke or watched the Ed Sullivan Show or tuned into the nightly news or whatever, and you got affected by what you were hearing. You got exposed to a number of different things, whether you liked it or not. And nowadays, I think one of the big differences, both in terms of television, but also in social media and also on radio, everything is so niched that people only see or listen or hear anything that confirms their desires and feelings, because that's the only areas that they know. Even on the news, there's conversation about why is the United States so divided, and how people don't listen to the other side, whatever the other side is. In fact, we probably don't just have 2 sides, right? Everybody's got whatever problems and whatever issues that are out there, and they're all important.
Yeah, it's so splintered now. And if there is any sense of, quote, political correctness, what's unfortunate is with all of the various splinters, the splinter groups look at each other and say, well, how come you're not part of my group? What's wrong with you?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's dangerous is there seems to be a certain amount of, I won't say hatred necessarily, although it might be in some
seems like it
with some people.
Yeah,
but certainly it's us versus them kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's very counterproductive, and it hurts. So, and I don't care what side you're on. It's just it's like that's not the way to go, and that's an unfortunate thing. The other thing is, getting back to sort of the musical aspect of it, or even the artistic aspect of it, I don't know what people in these little niches will come up with artistically. The reason the Box Tops got where they got to probably was because we were influenced by the soul music and the rock and roll that had come out of Memphis, and combining those 2 things, and the rockabilly music that came out of Memphis, and sort of combining it all up into something else, and taking the British invasion music and combining that with it, and we came up with something that was unique in some way. But if you're only listening to one thing, and I don't care how good that thing is, you could be listening to the Beatles and you might create a sort of Beatle-like thing, but you won't create anything newer than whatever the Beatles did, right?
That's true. Coming up with something new. Yeah. Well, is there? I've asked the question more than a zillion times. Is there really anything new, or is?
Yeah. Well, that's my point too. Is that no? It's combining things. There's a word for it. Acceptation is what I've heard it called in some conferences. It's where things that were designed for one purpose are used for a completely different purpose.
Okay.
And that's a jump. That's more than evolution. Evolution is where something's designed and it begins to, or is, and it begins to develop, and there's small changes, incremental changes. Acceptation is where, well, one example, it's sort of a funny kind of example, but I'll just say it. Dinosaurs, they sort of talk about how they really had feathers, right? And the reason why they had feathers was to keep them warm. And some of them had these feathers for the reason of warmth and protection from the element. And then eventually, at some point, one of them fell or did something and started to fly. And then so the feather became more than just a warmth kind of vehicle. It actually became useful for flying. And that's an example of acceptation.
I've got to check that out. I've never heard the word before. Acceptation. It's an interesting word and an intriguing concept.
It's not an evolution. It's an actual, and it's not, I mean, I gave sort of a silly example, but hopefully it's clear enough that you'll understand and the listeners will understand, that concept. Mm-hmm. There is a point at which something that was used for one thing, and I forget what, well, I don't know, I mean, Edison or somebody invented the laser, but he didn't know what to do with it, or somebody else had Teflon, and, they used it for one thing, but now it's in all the, for all these other kind of reasons. That's acceptation. That's adapting something from another thing with no conspicuous relationship between the two. And that's what I'm suggesting, that, when you're artistic, you're actually looking for things to influence you, and what you do is you pick up, whether you know it or not, pick up whatever it is, and then you combine it in some unique way. And then if you're lucky, like I was and like you were, you actually add to the pile of whatever's out there artistically.
That's true. What an enjoyable hour. I know we could go even longer. There's just so many things that you can talk about, and you're really an interesting guy with an awful lot of stuff going on. So I have to say a major thank you for this last hour, and we need to figure out how to stay in touch. I will get back to you, but we should probably try and reconnect somewhere down the line. Again, thank you so much. A very entertaining hour.
Oh, you're welcome, and thanks for having me, Dick. I appreciate it.
All right, you take care.
Okay.
Until next week, keep your face in a smile. It makes everything worthwhile. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to America's Oldies But Goodies with Dick Scapatoni. Join us again next week for more memories from the good old days. In the words of Jerry Garcia, what a long, strange trip it was. The swingin' 60s. I'm John Berg. See you then.